The sweltering summer sun of Atlanta, Georgia, cast long shadows over the courthouse steps as Judge Malcolm Harris exited the building. His robes, dark as the night sky, carried the weight of justice, but also something more personal. Today, justice felt fragile. He paused at the top of the steps, the gentle hum of cicadas filling the air, and scanned the parking lot where a sleek, jet-black Tesla Model S sat gleaming in the sunlight. For most, it would be just a car. For Malcolm, it was a symbol of his relentless climb in a system built to keep him at the bottom. Born to a single mother in a crumbling neighborhood on Atlanta's west side, Malcolm had spent his youth dodging pitfalls, both literal and metaphorical. The temptation of quick money, the cold gaze of police officers, the suffocating stereotypes, they were all ghosts he'd fought to escape. He clutched the leather strap of his briefcase and walked to the car, his polished shoes tapping against the asphalt. Today had been particularly draining, a contentious case involving police misconduct against a young black man. Malcolm had ruled in favor of transparency, ordering the release of body camera footage. The courthouse buzzed with reporters and tension, but Malcolm kept his focus. That was his way, measured, deliberate, unyielding. Sliding into the driver's seat, Malcolm took a deep breath. The car was as silent as his contemplations. He tapped the touchscreen to play Nina Simone's "I Wish I Knew How It Would Feel to Be Free," her voice pouring over him like a balm for his tired spirit. As he pulled out of the lot, the world outside blurred. A mosaic of brick storefronts, shaded sidewalks, and restless people. A few blocks away, Officer Grant Turner adjusted his aviator sunglasses and leaned against his patrol car, sipping lukewarm coffee. The summer heat made the polyester uniform cling uncomfortably to his skin, and the hours dragged. Turner, a veteran officer with 15 years on the force, prided himself on his sharp eye. Some called him obsessive. He called it being thorough. He noticed the Tesla almost immediately. It was pristine, a high-end vehicle not often seen in this area, and something about it triggered his instincts. His gaze flicked to the driver, a black man, impeccably dressed but unfamiliar. Turner's mind began constructing narratives, most of them unfounded but persistent. He threw the coffee into the trash and slid into his cruiser. Malcolm noticed the blue and red lights in his rearview mirror just as he turned onto a quieter residential street. His stomach tightened, but he forced himself to stay calm. He'd been here before, too many times for comfort. This wasn't supposed to happen to a judge, not someone who'd proven himself 1,000 times over. But here he was. The siren blared once, sharp and commanding. Malcolm pulled over, rolled down his window, and placed both hands on the steering wheel. He stared straight ahead, his jaw tight. "Afternoon," Turner said as he approached the car. His hand hovered near his holster. "Do you know why I pulled you over?" Malcolm met his gaze in the side mirror. "No, officer." "I don't. License and registration." Turner's tone was clipped, his eyes scanning the interior of the car as though it might reveal secrets. Malcolm moved slowly, deliberately. "It's in my glove compartment. I'm reaching for it now." "Make it quick," Turner said. Malcolm retrieved the documents and handed them over. Turner examined them, his expression unreadable. After a moment, he frowned. "This car registered to you?" "Yes," Malcolm replied evenly. Turner squinted, as if searching for a lie. "You sure about that? A Tesla like this?" The insinuation hung in the air like a foul odor. Malcolm's jaw clenched tighter, but he kept his voice steady. "I'm sure, officer. Is there a problem?" Turner didn't answer. Instead, he walked back to his cruiser, running the plates and double-checking the registration. It all matched, but something about the situation still didn't sit right with him. Or maybe he didn't want it to. He returned to the Tesla, his hand resting on the edge of the car door. "You're Judge Harris, right?" Turner asked, his tone shifting slightly, though still laced with suspicion. "Yes," Malcolm said, his voice growing colder. "And I'd appreciate it if you told me the reason for this stop." Turner hesitated. He could feel the weight of his badge suddenly. He could also feel the weight of Malcolm's gaze, piercing and unflinching. But instead of backing down, he doubled down. There was a report of a stolen vehicle matching this description. I'll need you to step out of the car. Malcolm froze. This wasn't just an inconvenience. It was an insult, a deliberate undermining of everything he represented. That's absurd. This is my car, as your records just confirmed. Turner stepped back, his stance widening. I said, step out of the car. Malcolm's pulse quickened, but he refused to let fear dictate his actions. He opened the door slowly and got out, standing tall despite the unease coursing through him. You're making a mistake. The street was quiet except for the tension between the two men. A neighbor peeked out from behind a curtain, watching but not intervening. The world seemed to hold its breath. I need to search the vehicle, Turner said. Malcolm's voice dropped, low and firm. Not without a warrant. Turner's hand inched toward his radio. Refusal to comply isn't going to help you, Judge. The weight of systemic injustice pressed on Malcolm like a crushing tide. He had spent his career fighting these moments from behind a bench, but now he was in the crosshairs. It wasn't just about him. It was about every young man he'd defended, every mother he'd comforted after a verdict, every time he'd told himself the system could be better. As the standoff stretched, something deeper simmered beneath the surface, a collision of worlds, of power, of perception. And Malcolm knew this was only the beginning. The air hung thick with tension as Malcolm stood beside his Tesla, his hands steady despite the storm brewing inside him. Officer Turner's posture remained rigid, his presence commanding the street like an actor on a stage. A small crowd began to gather, neighbors stepping out of their homes to see the scene unfold. Malcolm noticed their faces, some concerned, others wary, and a few wearing expressions he knew all too well. Silent resignation. What exactly do you think you're going to find, officer? Malcolm asked, his voice measured but sharp. That's for me to determine, Turner replied, his hand still resting near his holster. Just following protocol. Malcolm almost laughed at the absurdity. Protocol or profiling? His words cut through the air like a blade. Turner's face hardened. He stepped back and grabbed his radio. Dispatch, this is Officer Turner. I need backup at my location. The request made Malcolm's blood boil. Backup? For what? The crowd murmured among themselves, the tension now palpable. From the corner of his eye, Malcolm spotted a young woman recording the scene on her phone. Good, he thought. Someone needs to see this. Minutes later, a second police cruiser arrived. Out stepped Officer Elena Morales, a rookie with only 2 years on the force. She approached with cautious curiosity, her eyes darting between Turner and Malcolm. What's the situation? Morales asked, her voice tinged with uncertainty. Possible stolen vehicle. Turner replied curtly, drivers being uncooperative. Malcolm turned to Morales, his frustration breaking through his usually composed demeanor. Uncooperative? I've provided everything you asked for. The registration, the license, it's all mine. This is harassment, plain and simple. Morales hesitated. Something about Malcolm's presence, his eloquence, his poise, clashed with the narrative Turner was constructing. She glanced at the Tesla, then back at Turner. Have you run the plates? Of course I ran the plates, Turner snapped. But that doesn't mean the story checks out. Morales frowned, sensing an undercurrent she didn't fully understand. Sir, she addressed Malcolm directly, her tone softer than Turner's. Would you be willing to wait while we sort this out? It shouldn't take long. Malcolm's eyes locked on hers. I've done nothing wrong, and yet I'm the one being asked to wait, to justify myself. Again. He took a deep breath, his voice steadier now. You're both operating under an assumption, a dangerous one. Do you even realize that? Before Morales could respond, a voice rang out from the crowd. He's a judge. It was the young woman with the phone, her defiance cutting through the oppressive atmosphere. That's Judge Harris. You can't just treat him like a criminal. Turner's jaw tightened. Ma'am, stay back, he barked, but the words only seemed to embolden the crowd. They began murmuring louder, their collective frustration bubbling to the surface. Malcolm turned to the young woman, giving her a small nod of appreciation before addressing Turner again. You're escalating this, officer. And for what? Your ego? Your prejudice? The words hit Turner like a slap, but instead of retreating, he stepped closer. "Watch it, Judge. You might think your position puts you above the law, but out here, it doesn't mean a damn thing." The crowd's reaction was swift, a mix of gasps and angry shouts. Morales stepped between the two men, her hands raised in a gesture of de-escalation. "Let's all take a step back," she urged, her voice firm but calm. "There's no need for this to get out of hand." But it already was. A deep rumble of an engine interrupted the standoff. A sleek black SUV pulled up, and out stepped Calvin Grayson, Malcolm's longtime friend and attorney. Calvin was a towering presence, his tailored suit and confident stride commanding immediate attention. He had received Malcolm's frantic text just minutes earlier and had come straight from his office. "What's going on here?" Calvin demanded, his voice slicing through the chaos. He approached Malcolm, placing a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "You okay?" Malcolm nodded, but didn't take his eyes off Turner. "I'm fine, but this officer seems determined to find a crime where there isn't one." Turner bristled. "Who are you?" "Calvin Grayson," he said, flashing his business card. "Attorney. And as of right now, this stop is over. You've run the plates, confirmed the registration, and yet you're still holding my client here without cause. That's illegal." Turner's face flushed red, but Calvin didn't give him a chance to respond. "If you continue to detain him, we'll be filing a formal complaint with the department and a lawsuit. Now, unless you have something concrete, I suggest you let Judge Harris leave." Morales looked at Turner, her expression conflicted. She could sense the tide turning. The crowd was growing restless, their phones capturing every word, every gesture. This wasn't just a traffic stop anymore. It was a spectacle. Finally, Turner stepped back, his face a mask of barely concealed anger. "Fine," he muttered, "but this isn't over." "Oh, it's over," Calvin shot back, his tone icy. He turned to Malcolm, his voice softening. "Let's go." Malcolm nodded, but as he opened the car door, he glanced back at Turner. "It's over for now," he said quietly, "but I'll see you again." The Tesla's engine hummed to life, and Malcolm drove away, his heart pounding with a mix of relief and fury. In the passenger seat, Calvin was already strategizing, his voice a steady stream of legal jargon. But Malcolm's mind was elsewhere, on the crowd, on the officers, on the young woman who had dared to speak up. This wasn't just about him anymore. It never had been. And as much as he wanted to leave this moment behind, he knew it would follow him. Like a shadow, a scar, a challenge. Days after the humiliating encounter, Malcolm Harris sat in his home office, staring at his computer screen. The video of the stop had gone viral, amassing millions of views and sparking debates across social media. Headlines ranged from "Judge detained in shocking case of profiling" to "Justice system on trial when judges face injustice." The comments were a mix of outrage, support, and denial. Voices from every corner of the internet chiming in on a story that had become larger than Malcolm himself. His phone buzzed incessantly, reporters seeking interviews, colleagues expressing solidarity, and Calvin keeping him updated on the legal complaints they had filed against the Atlanta Police Department. Yet Malcolm couldn't focus on any of it. Something deeper gnawed at him, a question he couldn't shake. What comes next? The answer arrived 2 weeks later in the form of a letter, unmarked, and slid under his front door. It was handwritten in neat, deliberate script. "Judge Harris, if you want the truth about Officer Turner, meet me at Westlake Park tonight at 8 p.m. Come alone, a friend." Malcolm stared at the note, his pulse quickening. A part of him wanted to dismiss it. Anonymous messages rarely led to anything good. But another part, the part that had spent years untangling lies and uncovering buried truths, couldn't let it go. If there was something more to Turner's actions, something systemic, he needed to know. That evening, Malcolm parked his Tesla a few blocks from Westlake Park, swapping his usual tailored suit for jeans and a hoodie. The park was dimly lit, the faint glow of streetlights casting long shadows across the empty benches and worn paths. He walked cautiously, his every sense heightened. "Over here," a voice called out. Malcolm turned to see a figure emerge from the darkness, a man in his late 20s, thin and wiry, with a nervous energy that set Malcolm on edge. He wore a baseball cap pulled low over his face and glanced around constantly, as if expecting trouble. "You're the one who sent the note?" Malcolm asked, keeping his voice steady. The man nodded. "Name's Deshawn. I used to work with Turner." Kinda. Deshawn hesitated, then sighed. "I thought was his informant. He'd pay me to tip him off about stuff happening in the neighborhood, drug deals, stolen cars, whatever. But that ain't all he was about." Malcolm crossed his arms, his skepticism growing. "What does this have to do with me?" "Everything," Deshawn said, stepping closer. "Turner ain't just profiling random folks. He's got a side hustle, running confiscated cars through a chop shop on the south side. High-end stuff like your Tesla. He thought he could pin it on you, make it look like you stole it, then confiscate it and flip it for cash." The words hit Malcolm like a punch to the gut. He struggled to process the accusation, his mind racing. "And you have proof of this?" Deshawn nodded quickly.
"Yeah."
"I got texts, records, even pictures. He don't know I kept but I was scared. Figured one day he'd turn on me, too." "Why come to me now?" Malcolm asked, his tone sharp. "Because you're the only one who can do something about it," Deshawn said, his voice trembling. "And I can't live with this anymore. Turner's dangerous. He don't just ruin lives, he ends them." Malcolm's chest tightened. He wanted to dismiss Deshawn as just another desperate man looking for redemption, but the details lined up too well. Turner's overzealous behavior, his refusal to back down despite clear evidence, the escalation of their encounter, all of it painted a picture of someone who believed himself untouchable. "Show me the proof," Malcolm said. Deshawn reached into his jacket and pulled out a flash drive. "Everything's on here, but you didn't get it from me." If Turner finds out, he trailed off, the fear in his eyes speaking volumes. Malcolm took the drive, his mind already formulating a plan. "Stay out of sight. If this is as big as you say it is, Turner won't just come after me." Deshawn nodded, then disappeared into the shadows as quickly as he'd appeared. Back in his home office, Malcolm inserted the flash drive into his computer, his heart pounding. The screen lit up with files, text messages detailing Turner's schemes, spreadsheets tracking stolen vehicles, and grainy photos of Turner at what appeared to be a chop shop. It was damning evidence, enough to dismantle not only Turner's career but potentially expose corruption within the department itself. Malcolm leaned back in his chair, the weight of the discovery pressing down on him. He had fought countless battles in the courtroom, but this was different. This was personal. The next morning, Malcolm called Calvin. "We need to talk," he said, by afternoon. They were seated in Calvin's office, the evidence spread across the desk. Calvin's face darkened as he scanned the files. "This is explosive," he said, "but it's also dangerous. If we go public with this, Turner and whoever he's working with will come after you. Hard." "I don't care," Malcolm said firmly. "This isn't just about me. It's about everyone Turner's hurt, and everyone he'll keep hurting if we stay silent." Calvin sighed, rubbing his temples. "All right, we'll do it the right way. I'll contact the Department of Justice, the FBI. This needs to be handled at the highest level." But before they could take the next steps, Malcolm's phone buzzed with an unknown number. Hesitantly, he answered. A familiar voice crackled on the other end. "You think you're untouchable, Judge? Think again." It was Turner, and Malcolm's grip tightened on the phone. "You've already lost, officer. It's over." Turner laughed coldly. "You're making a big mistake. You don't know who you're dealing with." The line went dead, leaving Malcolm in a silence more chilling than any threat. Calvin looked at him, concern etched on his face. "What did he say?" Malcolm set the phone down, his resolve hardening. That it's just beginning. Malcolm sat in his chambers, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the room. The evidence from Deshawn's flash drive had been handed over to Calvin, who in turn had secured meetings with FBI agents to launch an official investigation. The case was already moving beyond their control, yet Malcolm couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking a razor's edge. The phone call from Turner lingered in his mind. His words weren't just a threat, they were a promise. Turner wasn't going to let this end quietly, and Malcolm knew that silence wasn't an option either. For the first time in his life, Malcolm felt the weight of vulnerability, A knock on the door jolted him from his thoughts. It was Lena, his law clerk, a perceptive young woman with a sharp mind and a deep respect for Malcolm's integrity. She stepped inside, her brow furrowed. "Judge Harris, there's someone here to see you," she said hesitantly. "He says it's urgent." "Who is it?" "A man named Deshawn. He looks nervous." Malcolm's heart skipped a beat. "Bring him in." Lena nodded, and moments later, Deshawn entered, his gaze darting around the room like a trapped animal. His hands trembled as he clutched a crumpled envelope. "Judge, we got a problem," Deshawn blurted, his voice barely above a whisper. "What happened?" Malcolm asked, motioning for him to sit. "They know," Deshawn said, his words tumbling out in a rush. "Turner and his crew, they know I gave you that flash drive. I don't know how, but they know." Malcolm's stomach sank. "Are you in danger?" Deshawn nodded frantically. "They came to my place last night, tore it apart, left a message on my wall. You're next. I don't know where else to go." Malcolm exchanged a glance with Lena, who had lingered in the doorway, her expression a mix of shock and concern. "You did the right thing coming here," Malcolm said, keeping his voice calm despite the storm brewing inside him. "We'll get you protection." "Protection?" Deshawn scoffed. "From who?" "Turner's got friends everywhere. Cops, dealers, even some judges. No one's safe." Malcolm's jaw tightened. The scope of Turner's reach was becoming clearer, and it was worse than he'd imagined. "I'll call Calvin," Malcolm said firmly. "We'll make sure you're safe." But even as he spoke, he felt the weight of responsibility pressing down on him. Deshawn wasn't just a whistleblower. He was a target, and by extension, so was Malcolm. That evening, Calvin arranged for Deshawn to stay at a safe house monitored by federal agents. Malcolm returned home, his mind racing with the implications of Turner's network. He couldn't help but feel a gnawing doubt. What if Turner's corruption went deeper than even the FBI could handle? As he stepped into his house, he froze. The door was ajar, and a faint light flickered inside. Cautiously, Malcolm entered, his hand instinctively reaching for his phone. The living room was in disarray, papers scattered, furniture overturned. On the wall, scrawled in bold, red letters, were the words, "Stay out of this." Malcolm's breath caught in his throat. His sanctuary, the place where he found solace and strength, had been violated. The message was clear. Turner was sending a warning. He called the police, but as the officers surveyed the scene, Malcolm couldn't help but notice their reluctance. They took notes, asked questions, but their demeanor suggested they weren't eager to dig too deep. After they left, Malcolm sat in the wreckage of his living room, his resolve hardening. Turner wanted him to be afraid, to back down. But fear had no place in Malcolm's life. He had faced prejudice, systemic injustice, and personal loss before. He wasn't about to let a man like Turner win. The next day, Malcolm returned to the courthouse with a renewed sense of purpose. He had a hearing scheduled, one involving a young man accused of drug possession. As he listened to the defense attorney's argument, Malcolm couldn't help but think about Deshawn and all the others who had been caught in Turner's web. When it was his turn to speak, Malcolm's voice rang with conviction. The law must serve justice, not power. And it is our duty, as stewards of the law, to ensure that justice prevails, not for the few, but for all. The words weren't just for the courtroom. They were for himself. A reminder of why he had chosen this path and why he couldn't abandon it now. Over the following weeks, the FBI's investigation began to uncover more evidence of Turner's corruption. Several of his associates were arrested, and the chop shop operation was shut down. But Turner remained elusive, his whereabouts unknown. Malcolm knew the fight wasn't over. Turner's network might have been exposed, but the man himself was still out there, and the danger loomed larger than ever. Late one night, as Malcolm worked on his next case, he received a call from Calvin. "We've got a problem," Calvin said, his voice grim. "Turner's gone underground, but he's not done. He's coming after you." Malcolm leaned back in his chair, his pulse steady despite the gravity of the words. "Let him come," he said quietly. "I'm ready." And he was. For the first time in weeks, Malcolm felt a sense of clarity. This wasn't just about exposing corruption or seeking justice. It was about standing firm in the face of fear, about refusing to be silenced. The storm was far from over, but Malcolm wasn't afraid of the rain. The night was silent, unnervingly so, as Malcolm sat in his study, the glow of his desk lamp casting long shadows on the wall. Calvin's warning echoed in his mind. "Turner's coming after you." Despite the looming threat, Malcolm had refused to flee or hide. This was his fight now, and he intended to see it through. Suddenly, his phone buzzed. The number was unknown, but Malcolm answered anyway, his gut telling him it was important. Judge Harris. The voice on the other end rasped, barely audible. "Who is this?" Malcolm asked, leaning forward, his heart pounding. "It's Deshawn," the voice whispered. "They found me." The line crackled, and Malcolm could hear heavy breathing, followed by faint, hurried footsteps. "Where are you?" Deshawn's voice was barely coherent. "Safe house, not safe. They're everywhere. I don't know who to trust anymore." The line went dead. Malcolm's blood ran cold. He immediately called Calvin, who picked up on the first ring. "Deshawn just called me," Malcolm said quickly. "He's in trouble. They've found him." Calvin swore under his breath. "We've got agents watching him." How could? He stopped, realization dawning. Turner must have someone on the inside. Damn it. Where was he calling from? "I don't know," Malcolm admitted, "but we need to find him." "I'll make some calls," Calvin said. "Stay put. Don't do anything reckless." Malcolm hung up, but staying put wasn't an option. Deshawn had risked everything to expose Turner, and Malcolm wasn't about to abandon him. Within minutes, Malcolm was driving through the dimly lit streets of Atlanta, his hands gripping the wheel tightly. He remembered Deshawn mentioning a safe house in the southern part of the city. If Turner's men had breached it, time was of the essence. The streets grew quieter as Malcolm approached the industrial district, the distant hum of the city fading into an eerie stillness. His Tesla's headlights illuminated the address Calvin had once mentioned, a nondescript building with boarded-up windows. As he stepped out of the car, Malcolm's senses heightened. The air was thick with tension, the faint scent of gasoline and rust lingering. He approached the building cautiously, his heart racing inside. The scene was chaos. Furniture was overturned, papers scattered across the floor. And there, slumped against the wall, was Deshawn, blood trickling from a gash on his forehead. "Deshawn." Malcolm rushed to his side, shaking him gently. Deshawn's eyes fluttered open, his face contorted in pain. "Judge, they're still here." Before Malcolm could respond, the sound of footsteps echoed from the hallway. He turned, his breath catching as two figures emerged from the shadows. One of them unmistakably Officer Turner. Well? Turner drawled, a cruel smile spreading across his face. "Look who decided to play hero." Malcolm stood, positioning himself between Turner and Deshawn. "It's over, Turner. The FBI knows everything. Your operation, your network, it's done." Turner laughed, the sound chilling in its confidence. "You think the feds scare me? I've been in this game a long time, Judge. People like me don't go down easy." "You're a coward," Malcolm said, his voice steady despite the fear gripping him. "You hide behind a badge, using it to hurt the very people you're supposed to protect. That ends now." Turner's expression darkened, and he took a step forward, his hand moving toward his waistband. "Don't," Malcolm warned, his voice firm. "The FBI is watching. You make one wrong move, and they'll have enough to bury you." For a moment, the room was silent, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Then Turner's accomplice, a younger man with a nervous energy, spoke up. "We should go, man. This ain't worth it." Turner glared at him, but the hesitation in his eyes was clear. He was calculating his options, weighing the risks that end that brief pause. The sound of sirens pierced the night. Red and blue lights flashed through the cracks in the boarded windows, illuminating the room in bursts of color. Turner's expression shifted from confidence to panic. "You set me up," he hissed, his gaze locking onto Malcolm. "I didn't have to," Malcolm replied. "You did this to yourself." The door burst open and federal agents poured in, weapons drawn. "Freeze. Hands where we can see them." Turner and his accomplice had no choice but to comply, raising their hands as the agents moved in to arrest them. Malcolm let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding as one of the agents approached him. "Judge Harris, are you all right?" "I'm fine," Malcolm said, glancing back at Deshawn, who was being tended to by a medic. "But he needs help." The agent nodded, signaling for assistance. A.S. Turner was led away in handcuffs. He shot Malcolm a venomous glare. "This isn't over, Harris. You hear me? This isn't over." Malcolm met his gaze, unflinching. "It is for you." The agent secured the scene, and Malcolm finally allowed himself to sit, exhaustion washing over him. The fight had been long and grueling, but in this moment, justice had prevailed for Deshawn, for himself, and for everyone Turner had wronged. Malcolm had stood firm. And while the battle wasn't without its scars, the victory was undeniable. As the night gave way to dawn, Malcolm felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in weeks. The storm had passed, and the light was beginning to break through. The courtroom was silent as Malcolm took his seat on the bench. The case before him wasn't extraordinary, a routine property dispute, but today was different. Today, he sat knowing that the shadows lurking in his city had finally been dragged into the light. Turner's arrest had sent shockwaves through the legal and law enforcement communities. The subsequent investigation unraveled years of corruption, implicating more than a dozen individuals across various departments. Turner's web was vast, but with him in custody, it had begun to collapse. The trial was set to begin in a few weeks, with Calvin serving as the lead prosecutor. Deshawn, though still shaken, had agreed to testify, his courage rekindled by Malcolm's unwavering support. The FBI had offered him witness protection, but he insisted on staying in Atlanta. "I've spent my whole life running," Deshawn had told Malcolm during one of their conversations. "It's time I stand my ground." Malcolm had admired his resolve. It reminded him of his own journey, of the countless battles he'd fought to carve out his place in a system that wasn't built for him. As the court session ended, Malcolm returned to his chambers. The familiar weight of responsibility was there, but it was tempered by a newfound sense of hope. Lena, his law clerk, entered with a stack of files. The FBI sent over the transcripts from their latest interviews. "They thought you might want to see them." "Thank you, Lena," Malcolm said, taking the files. He glanced up at her, noticing the hint of worry in her eyes. "How are you holding up?" She hesitated before answering. "Honestly, it's been a lot to process. But seeing how you've handled all of this, it's inspiring, Judge Harris. It reminds me why I wanted to work in law." Her words touched Malcolm more than he let on. He nodded, offering her a small smile. "That means a lot, Lena. Thank you." After she left, Malcolm opened the top file. It contained a detailed report on Turner's network, names, dates, operations. The sheer scale of it was staggering. But what struck Malcolm most was a single note scribbled in the margin by one of the agents. Without Judge Harris, none of this would have been possible. He leaned back in his chair, letting the words sink in. He hadn't sought recognition or praise. All he'd wanted was to do the right thing, even when it seemed impossible. That evening, Malcolm attended a community event in downtown Atlanta. It was a gathering of local leaders, activists, and residents, many of whom had been directly or indirectly affected by Turner's actions. As Malcolm stepped onto the small stage to speak, the crowd quieted. He looked out at the faces before him, diverse, resilient, hopeful. "Good evening," he began, his voice steady. "Over the past few weeks, we've seen a part of our city that many would rather ignore. We've seen corruption, betrayal, and abuse of power. But we've also seen courage. Courage from people like Deshawn, who risked everything to speak the truth. Courage from the community, who refused to stay silent." He paused, letting his words resonate. Justice is not a destination, it's a journey. And that journey is not always easy. It demands sacrifice, resilience, and faith. But together, we can ensure that justice is not just an idea, but a reality for everyone. The crowd erupted into applause, their cheers a testament to their collective resolve. As Malcolm stepped off the stage, he was approached by a young boy no older than 10. The boy's mother stood nearby, watching with a mixture of pride and gratitude. "Are you the judge who stopped the bad guys?" the boy asked, his wide eyes full of wonder. Malcolm knelt to the boy's level, a warm smile on his face. "I'm just one person, but yes, I tried to help stop them." The boy beamed. "I want to be like you when I grow up." Malcolm's throat tightened with emotion. He placed a hand on the boy's shoulder. "You can be even better. Just remember to always stand up for what's right." As the boy ran back to his mother, Malcolm felt a profound sense of purpose. The fight wasn't over. There would always be more battles to face, more challenges to overcome. But moments like this reminded him why he fought in the first place. The next morning, Malcolm returned to his routine, but with a renewed vigor. His days were still long, filled with hearings and casework, but the shadows that had once loomed over him had begun to lift. Turner's trial dominated the headlines, and as the evidence mounted, it became clear that justice would be served. Malcolm followed the proceedings closely, though he remained focused on his own duties. Months later, when the guilty verdict was announced, Malcolm allowed himself a rare moment of satisfaction. Turner had been sentenced to life in prison without parole, a fitting end for a man who had caused so much harm. As Malcolm left the courthouse that day, he paused on the steps, looking out at the city he called home. It wasn't perfect, far from it, but it was worth fighting for. And Malcolm Harris would continue to fight, not for recognition or accolades, but for the simple, unwavering belief that justice was worth every sacrifice. The sun set over Atlanta, painting the skyline with hues of gold and crimson. The city buzzed with its usual energy, car horns, distant chatter, the rhythm of a place always moving forward. But for those who had been part of the battle against corruption, the pace felt slower, more reflective, as they began to rebuild their lives. Malcolm stood on the balcony of his modest home, sipping a cup of tea as he watched the city lights twinkle. It had been 6 months since Turner's trial ended, and though the weight of the fight had lifted, its impact lingered. His living room, once vandalized with threats, now felt like a place of peace again. The walls bore new photographs of community gatherings, courtroom victories, and moments with friends who had become family. The doorbell rang, pulling him from his thoughts. He opened it to find Deshawn standing there, a hesitant smile on his face. "Evening, Judge," Deshawn said, holding up a bag of takeout. "Thought I'd stop by. Brought Thai." Malcolm chuckled, stepping aside to let him in. "You didn't have to do that, but I'm not complaining. Come in." They sat at the dining table, the aroma of pad thai and green curry filling the room. Deshawn looked healthier than Malcolm had seen him in months. His scars, both physical and emotional, were beginning to fade. "How's the new job?" Malcolm asked between bites. Deshawn grinned. "It's good. Tough, but good. Working with the youth center feels, right, you know? Like I'm finally doing something that matters." "You always mattered, Deshawn," Malcolm said firmly. "You just needed a chance to see it for yourself." Deshawn nodded, his expression thoughtful. "I wouldn't be here without you, Judge. You believed in me when no one else did." Malcolm waved him off. "You did the hard part, Deshawn. I just pointed you in the right direction." As they ate, the conversation turned to lighter topics, movies, sports, and the upcoming community fair. For a moment, the heavy shadows of their shared past seemed to fade, replaced by the warmth of friendship. Later that night, after Deshawn left, Malcolm sat alone in the quiet of his home. His thoughts drifted to the boy he'd met at the community event, the one who wanted to be like him when he grew up. That memory stayed with him, a reminder of the responsibility he carried and the hope he inspired. The following week, Malcolm attended the unveiling of a new community initiative, a partnership between local leaders, activists, and law enforcement to rebuild trust and accountability. The event was held at the same youth center where Deshawn now worked, a symbol of resilience and progress. As Malcolm addressed the crowd, he spoke not as a judge, but as a member of the community. "Change doesn't happen overnight," he said, "but it starts with us, with each decision we make, each step we take toward a better future. This isn't the end of the journey, it's the beginning." The applause that followed was warm and genuine, a testament to the collective determination of those gathered. In the months that followed, Atlanta began to heal. Turner's network had been dismantled, and with it, a renewed sense of justice took root. Corruption hadn't been eradicated, but the community's vigilance made it clear that such darkness would no longer go unchecked. For Malcolm, life returned to a semblance of normalcy, though he was forever changed by the ordeal. He continued his work on the bench with the same integrity and dedication that had guided him through his darkest days. On quiet evenings, he often visited a local park, where he'd sit on a bench and watch the world go by. It was here that he found solace, surrounded by the laughter of children, the hum of conversations, and the simple beauty of life moving forward. One evening, as he sat there, a familiar voice called out, "Judge Harris." Malcolm turned to see Lena approaching, her face alight with excitement. "I got the acceptance letter," she said, holding up an envelope. Malcolm smiled. "Law school." She nodded. "Your alma mater, no less." He stood and hugged her warmly. "I'm proud of you, Lena. You're going to do great things." She pulled back, her eyes shining. "Because I learned from the best." As she walked away, Malcolm felt a swell of pride and hope. The fight for justice was ongoing, but it was one he knew he wouldn't face alone. The city continued to thrive, its people resilient and determined. And Malcolm, a quiet warrior in the pursuit of justice, remained steadfast in his commitment to a better world. As the lights of Atlanta twinkled in the night, Malcolm closed his eyes, letting the warmth of possibility wash over him. The storm had passed, and the horizon was clear. The story ends with Malcolm's journey inspiring others, proving that even in the face of overwhelming odds, one person's courage can spark change. The fight for justice is eternal, but with people like Malcolm, hope will always endure.